Let's do one more subtraction problem, and this one's a little bit different because we have a bunch of zeros on top. So we already learned that zeros are not a whole number. So the borrowing, when we have a bunch of zeros on top, even though it's the same concept, it's a little trickier. So let's go ahead and go through this problem so you can kind of see what's going to happen. All right, so the first thing we want to do is make sure that our bigger number is on top. We know that 1,000 is greater than, or it's bigger than 456, so we put it on top. And then we just want to make sure that our ones line up with our ones, our tens line up with our tens, and so on and so forth. So once we have that all set up, we notice that we have 0 minus 6. So 0 minus 6, can't do that with whole numbers. So in whole numbers, we're not using integers, we're not going into the negatives. So what do we have to do? We have to borrow from this. But what is this? This is a 0 too. And so eventually we're gonna have to borrow from this, but this is a 0. You can't borrow from a 0 because it's nothing, okay? So what is gonna happen is we're gonna borrow, this is 0. We know that in the ones place, the rule for borrowing is whenever you borrow, you add 10, okay? So 0 plus 10 equals 10. 0 plus 10 is going to equal 10, but remember we borrowed from this 10 and we borrowed one of them. So instead of this being a 10, it's going to become a 9. But then we would have to borrow from this too, because remember these are a bunch of zeros and we just have to keep borrowing until we get to an actual whole number. All right, so we are borrowing from this one, but again, this is a 10 and we borrowed from it already. So this is going to become a 9. So even though it was a 10, we borrowed one from it to make this a 10, and then we borrowed it to make this a 10. So the 10 goes all the way over onto the right. All the other zeros become 9s until we get to the first whole number. When we get to the first whole number, that is where we actually get our borrowing from, okay? So we do one less than or when we get to our first whole number, we do one less than it. So 1 minus 1 equals 0. So now that we've done all the borrowing, we can go ahead and do the subtracting. So 10 minus 6 is 4. 9 minus 5 is 4. 9 minus 4 is 5. And 0 minus 0 just equals 0. And so remember, if you want to check yourself, you take these two numbers and we add them. We do the opposite operation. So opposite of subtraction is addition. So if you add those two numbers, you should get 1,000. Okay, so just remember that when you're subtracting and you have a number that has a bunch of zeros on top, that the first time you borrow, you're going to borrow all from all those zeros until you get to your first whole number, and that's where you're actually borrowing from all the way back to the ones place. So just keep that in mind. It's the same concept, it's just a little bit trickier because you're trying to borrow from 0 and you can't borrow from a 0 because there's nothing there.